They said you'd become pessimistic, negative, that you'd lost your spark, your faith in people, your belief in the good. And maybe for a moment you believed them. Maybe you wondered if something inside you had broken, if all those years had hardened you into something you didn't want to be. But that's not what happened. What happened was simpler, clearer, more necessary than they could understand. You didn't lose hope. You just stopped giving it to people who weaponized it against you. You didn't stop believing in possibility. You stopped believing in promises from people whose track record was failure. You didn't become cynical. You became discerning. And there's a difference, a crucial one. Cynicism says nothing good exists. Discernment says good exists, but not everyone offering it is telling the truth. Cynicism closes all doors. Discernment just stops opening doors for people who've already proven they'll walk through. Take what they want and leave you holding the wreckage. You learn to read patterns, to listen to actions instead of words, to measure people not by what they said they'd do, but by what they actually did when no one was watching. And that shift from believer to observer wasn't loss, it was evolution. The painful, necessary kind. The kind that saves your life by teaching you who deserves access to it. So no, you didn't lose hope. You just stopped lending it to liars. This is the story of reclamation, of taking back the energy you used to scatter freely and learning to invest it strategically, of understanding that hope isn't infinite, that trust isn't renewable. That belief, once broken too many times, requires evidence to rebuild. And most people aren't willing to provide that evidence. They want your faith without earning it, your trust without proving it, your hope without honoring it. And for years you gave it to them. Not because you were naive, but because you believed in second chances, in redemption, in the idea that people would rise to meet the faith you placed in them. But they didn't. Most of them didn't even try. And the ones who did try only lasted as long as it benefited them. So you learned, slowly at first. Then all at once, you learned that lending hope to people who don't value it is like lending money to people who never intended to pay it back. It's not generosity, it's self-destruction. And you've destroyed yourself enough. So before we go deeper, I need to ask you something. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching this from. Because this message is reaching men all over the world who've learned this same lesson, who've stopped lending hope to liars. And I want to know where you are, where you're standing, where you're rebuilding with eyes wide open. It started with small things. Promises that didn't get kept, plans that fell through, words that sounded good in the moment but dissolved under the weight of reality. At first you made excuses for them. Everyone's busy, life happens, people mean well even when they fall short, and that's true. To a point. But you started noticing a pattern. The same people kept making the same promises. The same excuses kept appearing in different forms. The same disappointments kept arriving right on schedule. And each time they'd look you in the eye and tell you it would be different next time. They'd apologize, explain, promise to do better, and you'd believe them. Not because you were foolish, but because you wanted to. Because hope is easier than acceptance. Because believing people will change is more comfortable than accepting they won't. So you kept lending them your hope, your trust, your willingness to believe that this time would be different, but it never was. The friend who always needed help, but was never available when you did. The business partner who talked about shared success, but only showed up for their share. The family member who promised to change, but kept repeating the same destructive patterns. The romantic interest who said all the right things, but whose actions told a completely different story. One by one, they took your hope and returned nothing. And for a long time you blamed yourself. Maybe you weren't clear enough about your expectations. Maybe you were asking too much. Maybe you needed to be more patient, more understanding, more willing to see their potential instead of their pattern. So you lowered your standards, made more allowances, extended more grace. But the outcome remained the same, because the problem wasn't your expectations, it was their intentions. They never intended to honor what they promised. They just needed you to believe they would long enough to get what they wanted. And once they got it, the promises evaporated. The commitment dissolved. The person you thought you knew revealed themselves to be exactly who they'd always been. Someone who valued what you could provide more than who you actually were. And that realization, when it finally landed, changed everything. because you understood then that you hadn't been investing in relationships. You'd been funding illusions. You hadn't been building connections. You'd been maintaining fantasies. Fantasies about who these people could be if they just tried, if they just cared, if they just valued you the way you valued them. But they didn't. And no amount of your hope was going to change that, because hope isn't alchemy. It doesn't transform people who don't want to be transformed. It just exhausts the person doing the hoping. So you made a decision, not a loud one, not an angry one, just a clear one. You would stop lending hope to people whose actions had already proven they wouldn't honor it. You would stop trusting words without watching for follow-through. You would stop giving chances to people who'd already shown you exactly who they were. And that decision felt like betrayal at first. Like you were becoming the kind of person you never wanted to be. Cold, closed off, unwilling to believe in people. But that feeling was a lie, a manipulation, because protecting yourself from people who hurt you isn't coldness, it's intelligence. And refusing to keep funding someone else's lies isn't cynicism, it's self-respect. The shift required something you hadn't given yourself permission to do before, to trust your own experience more than their explanations, to value your own pattern recognition more than their promises of change, to believe what you'd seen with your own eyes more than what they told you to believe. And that permission, once granted, changed the entire framework. You stopped arguing with reality, stopped trying to convince yourself that people were different than they'd shown themselves to be, stopped hoping that this time, somehow, the pattern would break. Because patterns don't break unless the person creating them wants them to break. And most people don't. Most people are perfectly comfortable with who they are. They just need you to be uncomfortable enough with it to keep making excuses for them, to keep lowering your standards, to keep accepting less than you deserve. And you'd done that long enough, so you stopped. Not with fanfare, not with explanations. You just stopped showing up for people who'd never shown up for you. Stopped believing words that had never been backed by action. Stopped investing hope in people who'd already spent every bit you'd given them and were back asking for more. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was clarifying. Because in that silence, you could finally hear yourself think, could finally assess the relationships in your life without the noise of obligation or guilt, or the fear of being seen as negative. And what you saw was stark. Most of the people you'd been investing in weren't investing back. Most of the relationships you'd been maintaining were one-sided. Most of the hope you'd been lending was being used to fund someone else's comfort at your expense. And once you saw that clearly, you couldn't unsee it. The friend who only called when they needed something. The colleague who took credit for your work while offering nothing in return. The family member who demanded your time but was never available for yours. The partner who spoke of commitment but whose actions showed they were already 1 foot out the door. All of them had one thing in common. They'd been lying to you. Not always with words, but with actions. With the gap between what they promised and what they delivered. With the distance between who they claimed to be and who they actually were when it mattered. And you'd been covering that gap with your hope. Filling in the space between their words and their actions with your belief that they'd eventually close it themselves. But they never did, because they didn't need to. You were doing it for them. The shift didn't happen overnight. It accumulated, like sediment building into stone. Each broken promise added weight. Each empty apology added clarity. Each pattern repeated one more time added certainty. Until one day, you just knew. You knew that the person asking for another chance had already burned through all the chances that mattered. You knew that the opportunity being presented had the same structure as the last 3 that failed. You knew that the words being spoken, no matter how sincere they sounded, were just words. And words without action are just noise. So you started saying no, not aggressively, not with long explanations, just no. No, I can't help with that. No, I'm not available for that. No, I don't believe that anymore. And the responses were predictable. Some people got angry. How dare you not trust them? How dare you question their intentions? How dare you protect yourself from their pattern? Others got hurt, made you feel guilty for withdrawing, for not giving them the benefit of the doubt they'd already proven they didn't deserve. And a few just disappeared, which told you everything. Because if someone only stays in your life when you're useful to them, they were never there for you in the first place. They were there for what you provided. And the moment you stopped providing it, they had no reason to stay. That hurt. Not because you wanted them back, but because it confirmed what you'd suspected all along. Most of the relationships you'd invested in were transactional. Most of the people you'd trusted were conditional. And most of the hope you'd extended had been used as fuel for someone else's agenda. But once the hurt passed, something else emerged. Clarity, the kind you can't unsee. The kind that reorganizes everything you thought you knew. You started seeing the mechanics of manipulation more clearly. The way people would frame their requests to make you feel obligated. The way they'd reference past help you'd given to guilt you into giving more. The way they'd promise future reciprocity that never materialized. The way they'd play on your empathy, your loyalty, your desire to believe the best in people. And once you saw those mechanics, they stopped working. Because manipulation requires blindness. It requires you to focus on the words instead of the pattern, the promise instead of the history, the potential instead of the reality. And you weren't blind anymore. You'd learned to watch feet instead of listening to mouths, to measure consistency instead of accepting explanations, to value proof over potential. And that shift from hoping people would change to accepting who they actually were gave you something you hadn't had in years: power. Not power over them, power over yourself. The power to choose who got access to your energy. The power to withdraw from situations that didn't serve you. The power to say no without guilt, yes without resentment, and maybe without having to explain why. You realize that hope, when given indiscriminately, becomes a liability. But hope, when given strategically to people who've earned it, becomes an investment. And you'd spent too many years treating liabilities like investments, funding people who gave nothing back, believing in people who didn't believe in themselves enough to follow through, hoping for outcomes that required the other person to be someone they'd already proven they weren't. So you stopped. Not completely. You didn't become hopeless. You became selective. You didn't stop believing in people. You just stopped believing in people who'd shown you they weren't worth believing in. And that selectivity, that willingness to gatekeep your own hope, changed the entire landscape of your life. Because when you stop wasting energy on people who don't deserve it, you have energy left for people who do. When you stop funding liars, you can invest in truth tellers. When you stop hoping for change in people who won't change, you can start building with people who already are who they say they are. And those people exist. They're rare, but they exist. The ones whose actions match their words, whose presence is consistent, whose integrity doesn't fluctuate based on what they need from you. And once you stopped cluttering your life with the other kind, you finally had space to recognize them. You started noticing the small signals you'd been missing. The friend who showed up without being asked. The colleague who shared credit without needing recognition. The family member who respected your boundaries without taking offense. The person who said they'd do something and then actually did it without reminder or follow-up. These people had been there all along. You just hadn't seen them clearly because you'd been too busy managing the chaos created by everyone else. Too busy hoping the liars would become honest. Too busy trying to fix relationships that were broken by design. But now, with that noise removed, you could see clearly, could recognize quality when it appeared. Could invest your hope in people who'd already proven they deserved it. And that investment, focused and strategic, paid returns you'd never experienced before. Real connection, actual reciprocity. Relationships that didn't require constant maintenance because they were built on mutual respect rather than your willingness to overgive. And in those relationships, you found something you'd almost forgotten existed: ease. The ease of not having to second-guess someone's intentions. The ease of knowing that if they said they'd be there, they would be. The ease of trusting that your hope wouldn't be weaponized against you. And that ease, simple as it sounds, was revolutionary, because you'd spent so many years in tension, always wondering if this time would be different. Always hoping the pattern would break. Always giving people the benefit of the doubt they'd already proven they didn't deserve. But now, with your hope invested wisely, you didn't have to wonder. Didn't have to hope against evidence. Didn't have to lie to yourself about who people were. You could just see them clearly, accept them as they were, and choose accordingly. And that choice, exercised consistently, became the foundation of everything that followed. The rebuilding phase was strange, quiet, almost anticlimactic, because you weren't trying to become someone new. You were just trying to become honest. Honest about what you'd tolerated. Honest about why you'd tolerated it. Honest about what you actually wanted versus what you'd convinced yourself you should want. And that honesty required something most people avoid: stillness. The kind where you're not filling the silence with distractions or rationalizations or the voices of people who don't live your life. Just you and the truth. And the truth was uncomfortable. You'd spent years being the person people could count on. The reliable one. The one who showed up. The one who believed in them even when they didn't believe in themselves. And you'd worn that identity like armor. Proof of your character. Evidence of your worth. But underneath that armor was exhaustion, resentment, the quiet knowledge that most of what you were doing wasn't reciprocated, wasn't appreciated, wasn't even noticed unless you stopped doing it. And the moment you stopped, people noticed, but not because they missed you, because they missed what you provided. And that distinction, painful as it was, became your compass. It taught you to ask better questions. Not do they like me, but do they value me? Not do they need me, but do they respect me? Not do they want me around, but do they show up when I need them? And the answers, when you were honest enough to see them, were brutal. Most didn't. Most couldn't. Most wouldn't, even if they could. Because the relationship had never been built on mutuality. It had been built on your willingness to give more than you received. And the moment you stopped giving, there was nothing left to sustain it. So you let those relationships die. Not with drama. Not with confrontation. You just stopped resuscitating them. Stopped being the one who always reached out, always made plans, always checked in. And the ones that mattered found a way to stay. The ones that didn't simply faded, which told you everything you needed to know about where you'd been investing your hope. You'd been hoping people would become what they showed no interest in becoming. Hoping relationships would deepen when the other person had already decided this was as deep as it would go. Hoping for change in situations where change would require the other person to do work they had no intention of doing. And all that hope, well-intentioned as it was, had been wasted. Not because hope itself is bad, but because hoping for things that require other people to be different than they are is just denial with better lighting. So you redirected your hope, stopped aiming it at people, and started aiming it at possibilities you could actually control. You hoped you could build better boundaries, and you did. You hoped you could learn to recognize patterns faster, and you did. You hoped you could stop feeling guilty for protecting yourself, and slowly, you did. And that hope, the kind directed at your own growth rather than someone else's potential, actually paid off. Because it was based on reality, on your willingness to change, on actions you could take, not on someone else's promises. Not on potential that existed only in your imagination. Not on the fantasy that if you just believed hard enough, people would become who you needed them to be. You started investing your energy differently, into skills that would pay you back, into relationships with people whose actions matched their words, into opportunities that didn't require you to compromise your standards to pursue them. And the return on those investments was immediate, not in results, but in peace. The peace of knowing you weren't being lied to. The peace of knowing your energy was going somewhere that valued it. The peace of knowing that if something didn't work out, it wasn't because you'd been naive or foolish or too trusting. It was just because that particular path wasn't the right one. And that's okay, because not every path is meant for you. Not every person is meant to stay. Not every opportunity is meant to work out. And accepting that doesn't make you pessimistic. It makes you realistic. And realism, when paired with strategic hope, is unstoppable. You began to understand that the opposite of hope isn't despair. It's discernment. The ability to see clearly. To distinguish between people who mean what they say and people who say what you want to hear. Between opportunities that align with your values and opportunities that just sound good in the moment. Between relationships worth investing in and relationships that are just comfortable patterns you've outgrown. And that discernment, honed through years of lending hope to the wrong people, became your greatest asset. because you could finally see through the performance, through the promises, through the potential that was never going to materialize. You could see people as they actually were, not as they claimed to be, not as you hoped they'd become, but as their consistent actions had proven them to be. And that sight, clear and unfiltered, allowed you to make better decisions, faster decisions, decisions based on evidence rather than wishful thinking, decisions that protected your energy rather than depleted it, decisions that honored who you were becoming rather than who you used to be. You stopped giving third chances to people who'd already wasted the first two, stopped explaining your boundaries to people who'd already shown they wouldn't respect them. Stop trying to convince people of your worth when they'd already demonstrated they couldn't see it. And each time you made one of those decisions, you felt lighter, freer, more aligned with the truth of who you actually were rather than the person you'd been performing to keep everyone else comfortable. You realized that much of your exhaustion had come from managing other people's perceptions, from trying to make liars look honest by covering for their failures, from trying to make one-sided relationships look mutual by giving enough for both sides, from trying to make yourself small enough to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold you, but you weren't managing anymore, weren't covering, weren't shrinking. You were just being honest, clear, boundaried. And that authenticity, uncomfortable as it was for people who'd grown accustomed to your accommodation, was the most freeing thing you'd ever experienced. Because you weren't performing hope anymore, you were protecting it, investing it strategically, giving it only to people and situations that had earned it through consistent action over time. And that shift from scattered hope to strategic investment changed everything. The discipline came naturally once you understood the cost. The cost of lending hope to liars isn't just disappointment. It's time, energy, the slow erosion of your ability to trust your own judgment. Because every time you ignore the pattern and believe the promise, you teach yourself that your instincts don't matter, that your experience isn't valid, that you should override what you know to be true in favor of what you want to be true. And that override, repeated enough times, breaks something fundamental: your ability to trust yourself. So you stopped overriding, started listening to the quiet voice that said, "This doesn't feel right. This doesn't match their history. This sounds good but looks bad." And that voice, once you started honoring it, became louder, clearer, more accurate. It told you when someone was performing sincerity instead of embodying it, when an opportunity was designed to benefit them at your expense, when a relationship had already ended but hadn't been officially buried yet. And you listened, not with paranoia, not with suspicion, just with awareness, the kind that comes from experience, from pattern recognition, from understanding that people tell you who they are through their actions, and your job isn't to rewrite their story. It's to decide whether that story is one you want to be part of. Most of the time it wasn't, and that was okay, because you weren't trying to fill your life with people anymore. You were trying to fill it with quality, with consistency, with integrity, and those things are rare. So you became rare too. Rare in your willingness to walk away from situations that didn't serve you. Rare in your refusal to compromise your peace for someone else's comfort. Rare in your commitment to valuing proof over potential. And that rarity made you selective, inaccessible to people who weren't serious, unavailable for situations that required you to abandon your standards. And some people called that coldness, but you knew better. It wasn't cold. It was calibrated. You'd simply learned the difference between being open and being available to be used, between being hopeful and being naive, between believing in people and believing in fantasies about people. And that difference, subtle as it sounded, changed everything. You stopped attending events out of obligation, stopped maintaining friendships that had become one-sided, stopped giving advice to people who never took it, stopped lending money to people who had no intention of paying it back, stopped offering emotional support to people who disappeared the moment you needed the same. And each time you stopped, you expected guilt. But what you felt instead was relief. The relief of no longer carrying weight that wasn't yours. The relief of no longer pretending exhausting relationships were fulfilling. The relief of finally admitting that some people, no matter how much you hope they'll change, simply won't. And that's not your failure, it's their choice. Your only job is to decide whether you're willing to keep paying the cost of their choice, and you weren't, not anymore. So you built new standards, simple ones, non-negotiable ones. People had to show up consistently or they didn't get consistent access. Promises had to be backed by action or they didn't get believed. Patterns had to change or they got recognized for what they were. And those standards, enforced quietly but firmly, filtered out most of the noise. The people who couldn't meet them simply faded away, and the ones who could showed you what you'd been missing all along. Relationships that didn't require constant maintenance. Interactions that didn't leave you drained. Connections built on mutuality instead of your willingness to overgive. And those relationships, rare as they were worth more than all the others combined, because they were real, built on truth instead of hope, on evidence instead of potential, on who people actually were instead of who you wished they'd become. You started measuring relationships differently, not by how long they'd lasted, but by how much peace they provided. Not by how much history you shared, but by how much respect was present. Not by how comfortable they felt, but by how honest they allowed you to be. And those new measurements revealed something stark. Most of your longest relationships were also your most draining. Most of your history was with people who no longer aligned with who you were becoming. Most of your comfort was actually just familiarity with dysfunction. And once you saw that, you couldn't unsee it. Couldn't keep pretending that longevity meant quality, that history meant health, that comfort meant connection. So you started pruning, not viciously, not dramatically, just deliberately. You let relationships that no longer served anyone fade. Stopped investing energy in connections that only flowed one direction. Stopped showing up for people who'd proven they wouldn't show up for you. And what remained after that pruning was small, sparse, but real. A handful of people who'd proven themselves through action, who valued you enough to reciprocate, who showed up without needing to be asked, who kept their word without needing to be reminded. And those people, few as they were, became your foundation, the ones you could actually count on, the ones who'd earned your hope through consistency, the ones who didn't need you to lie to yourself about who they were. And in that small circle of trust, you found something you'd been searching for all along. Not more relationships, but better ones. Not more hope, but strategic hope. Not more belief in everyone, but earned belief in the few who'd proven themselves worthy of it. And that shift from quantity to quality, from scattered to strategic, from hoping to discerning, became the foundation of everything that followed. The victory came quietly. There were no announcements. No moment where everything clicked into place and you suddenly had it all figured out. Just a gradual realization that you'd stopped losing. Stopped losing sleep over people who didn't think twice about you. Stopped losing energy on situations that gave nothing back. Stopped losing faith in your own judgment because you'd finally started trusting it. And that shift, invisible to anyone watching from the outside, was everything to you. Because you weren't trying to win some grand prize. You were just trying to stop bleeding. Stop giving away pieces of yourself to people who didn't value them. Stop hoping for reciprocity from people who'd already shown you they were incapable of it. And once you stopped, once you finally sealed those leaks, you had something you hadn't had in years: reserves. Energy left at the end of the day. Emotional capacity for things that actually mattered. Mental space that wasn't constantly occupied by managing other people's chaos or hoping they'd change. And in that space you started building, not something loud, not something anyone else would notice, just something true. A life that didn't require constant explanation, relationships that didn't require constant repair, standards that didn't require constant compromise. And that life, quiet as it was, felt like victory. Not because it was perfect, but because it was yours, built on your terms, sustained by your choices, protected by your willingness to say no to anything that threatened it. You looked back at the version of yourself who used to lend hope to anyone who asked and felt no contempt. That version had been necessary, had taught you what needed to be learned, had shown you through pain and repetition who deserved your faith and who didn't. But you didn't need to be that version anymore. Didn't need to keep believing in people who'd already proven themselves unworthy of belief. Didn't need to keep hoping for change in people who'd already decided they were fine as they were. You'd learned that hope is a resource, limited, valuable, not to be given freely, but to be invested strategically in people and possibilities that had earned it. And most people hadn't earned it. Most situations hadn't warranted it. Most promises hadn't deserved it. So you stopped giving it. And in that stopping, in that refusal to keep funding, lies with your hope. You found something most people never find: clarity. The kind that doesn't waver. The kind that doesn't second-guess itself. The kind that knows, with quiet certainty, who deserves access and who doesn't, what's worth your energy and what isn't, which promises to believe and which to recognize as performance. And that clarity became your foundation, the thing you built everything else on. Not hope in people who hadn't earned it, but hope in yourself, in your ability to discern, to choose, to protect what matters. And that hope, the kind rooted in your own capacity rather than someone else's potential, never disappointed you, because it was based on truth, on evidence, on the reality of who you were becoming rather than the fantasy of who you wished others would be. The people who called you negative didn't understand what had happened. They thought you'd lost something, but you hadn't. You'd found something. Found the strength to stop participating in your own depletion. Found the clarity to recognize lies even when they were wrapped in pretty words. Found the courage to walk away from people and situations that required you to abandon yourself. And that finding, that discovery of your own worth, independent of anyone else's validation, changed everything. You stopped needing external proof that you mattered. Stopped seeking confirmation from people who'd already shown they couldn't provide it. Stopped hoping that if you just gave a little more, tried a little harder, believed a little longer, people would finally become who you needed them to be. Because you understood now that people are who they are, and your job isn't to change them. It's to decide if who they are is someone you want in your life. Most of the time they weren't, and that was okay. Because you'd rather have an empty seat at your table than one filled with someone who was only there to take from the meal. You'd rather have silence than conversation with people who only talked when they needed something. You'd rather have solitude than company that left you feeling more alone than when you were actually by yourself. And those preferences, clear and unapologetic, became your filter, the standard everything else had to pass through. And most things didn't pass. Most people didn't qualify. Most situations didn't warrant your participation. And instead of seeing that as loss, you saw it as clarity. The clarity to recognize that an empty life full of peace is better than a full life empty of it. That fewer relationships built on truth are worth more than many built on lies. That strategic hope invested wisely returns more than scattered hope given freely. You didn't lose hope. You just stopped lending it to liars. And in that stopping and that refusal to keep funding deception with your faith, you found what you'd been searching for all along. Not more people, but real people. Not more opportunities, but aligned opportunities. Not more hope, but protected hope. The kind that couldn't be weaponized against you. The kind that actually returned something when invested. The kind that made you stronger instead of leaving you depleted. And that hope, guarded and strategic and earned, became the foundation of a life you could finally recognize as your own. Not performed for others, not built on lies. Not sustained by your willingness to believe in people who'd already proven they weren't worth believing in, but built on truth, on evidence, on the solid ground of people and situations that had earned your trust through consistent action over time. And that ground, solid as it was, became the place you finally stopped running, stopped hoping things would be different, stopped believing in change that was never coming, and just stood, firm, clear, protected, with your hope intact. Not because you gave it to everyone, but because you finally learned to save it for the ones who deserved it. You didn't win the world. You just stopped letting it lie to you. And that was enough. More than enough. That was everything.